Welcome to an introductory presentation on the new 2022 Consolidated Application, which will be housed in Nexus in the upcoming year. Note that all content, screenshots, and information in these slides is representative of an application that is still in development. The final application may differ slightly from the information provided depending on developmental needs. All of MDE's grant applications are switching over from the old MEGS Plus system to the new Nexus platform. In doing so, MDE is looking to realize several benefits, including having one system for both grant management and payment, being able to link applications to MyKIP, and keeping all of the same features and functions in MEGS Plus in a more upgraded platform, as well as providing customizable user dashboards for ease in monitoring application activities, adding in an application status bar for ease of tracking status of applications in progress, and providing enhanced opportunities for tracking and monitoring of application modifications. In order to access the Consolidated Application in Nexus, users will need to follow the steps on the slide to create a MyLogin account, link your MEIS account used to access MEGS Plus to MyLogin, and request access to Nexus. You may need to log out of MyLogin and possibly close and restart your browser between each step for changes to be reflected and to be able to move on to the next step. If users successfully complete the steps listed, this spring, when the Consolidated Application goes live, it will show up in the opportunity list for all Level 5 users currently authorized to access the Con app in MEGS Plus. For other users, the Level 5 person will need to re-add individuals as needed for each application in Nexus when they go live. For more information, see www.michigan.gov/MDE-Nexus. The Nexus landing page will have features very similar to MEGS Plus, including a list of active tasks, a list of opportunities, announcements, and a search feature at the top to find applications. Navigating within Nexus will be by way of the slide navigation bar rather than having to revisit a View Edit screen. The slide navigation bar will have the ability to collapse and expand sections, which will vary based on application requirements. One of the first sections in the Consolidated Application will be the Grant Management section. The section will contain many standard screens such as the cover screen, general assurances, important information, and other similar screens. In addition, it will have the following new Grant Acceptance screen. On the Grant Acceptance screen, LEAs will see the available amounts for each grant that they may be able to accept. They will then need to indicate how much of the total availability they will be accepting. LEAs are encouraged to accept the full availability at the time they initially apply and may go back to this screen to make adjustments when the availability amount changes, if they wish to add the additional amounts to their application at that time. LEAs can also wait to make adjustments later on when they submit an amendment after the initial application has been approved. In Title I, if the carryover exceeds the 15% limit and the LEA has not applied for a waiver, the carryover available will be lower than the total carryover. This may be a signal to an LEA to apply for the waiver if they are eligible. At amendment, LEAs should ensure that they accept the full availability of any carryover in order for the calculations to work correctly in the application. Also, in the Grant Management section, LEAs will need to identify up front if they have private schools participating in any one of the federal programs which are subject to equitable services. This includes Title I Part A, Title I Part C, Title II Part A, Title III Part A, and Title IV Part A. This screen will not display for PSCs or ISDs where equitable services is not required. The next section in the Consolidated Application will gather information about the schools in the district. Many of these screens were formerly part of the Title I school selection or the Equitable Services worksheet. As before, LEAs will establish the grade span groups to be used to identify identify eligible schools for Title I programs. LEAs will then be asked to identify the grade span group each school in their LEA will be assigned to and provide student count information for those buildings. As before, fall count data will be preloaded. LEAs should ensure that the data is entered for each school on the list. No school should have a student count of 0. If an LEA went through reconfiguration or opened new schools, they may need to adjust the student count numbers pre-entered to account for the new or different configuration, and will need to check one of the boxes at the top to identify why the data differs from the expected values. LEAs will no longer enter any private school information on this screen. Next, an LEA with Title I programs and 1,000 or more students will need to make some choices about how their schools will be ranked. As before, LEAs can choose to rank high schools with greater than 50% low income above non-high schools with 75% or less low income. LEAs will also be able to choose to group and sort schools either district-wide or by grade span. New this year, if an LEA chooses grade span grouping, is the ability to decide which value will be used to determine eligibility within that grade span, either the district-wide percentage low income or the percent low income for the grade span. This can be set differently for each grade span, or the LEA can choose not to serve an entire grade span. If the LEA chooses not to serve a grade span, schools in that grade span with greater than 75% poverty will still be required to be served. The last decision an LEA will make regarding eligibility of schools is to choose to make any school eligible that has at least 35% of students from low-income families. For LEAs with the Title I program, the Title I eligible schools screen will be available with schools listed and sorted based on the information provided on prior screens. New this year is that the screen will show the groupings applicable for the district and will list all eligible and ineligible schools within the district. A change this year is that for LEAs to identify a school as skipped, to fund a Title I program fully with 31A, the LEA will select the program type and will check the skipped box. Skipped schools can now be designated as either targeted or school-wide. This will allow a skipped school to provide Title I-like services that are either targeted or school-wide if the school has transitioned to school-wide and has been approved to operate as such. As a reminder, all Title I schools, including skipped schools, should be completing the school-wide and targeted program description template. While they do not need to submit those templates anywhere, they should retain a copy locally and ensure that the program description is shared with parents and children within their school. As before, if a school was eligible and served last year but not eligible this year, no program type needs to be identified. In this example, see the Post Oak School. To serve a school that was eligible and served the prior year but is not eligible this year, previously referred to as grandfathered, in this example, see Beekman Center, the LEA must choose a program type for the school rather than check the grandfather box next to it. As before, if an LEA does not wish to serve an eligible school at the bottom of the rank order, the LEA should choose unfunded for the program type. See J.W. Sexton High School. If an LEA has participating private schools, the next screen they will come to will gather information about those schools. Private school data, both counts and participation, will now be added within the application rather than an external worksheet, except for Title III Part A consortiums. LEAs will now add or delete rows as needed to list all of the participating private schools in any one of the programs covered by the Consolidated Application. If the LEA has private schools participating in Title I, Part C, or Title III, Part A, they will also need to enter public school count data for those programs on this screen. The next section in the application will require districts to make decisions about transfers between funds. Since carryover from the amounts originally allocated to provide services to private schools is not eligible for transfer, this section will also gather information about any such carryover, if applicable. On the first screen of this section, LEAs will be required to identify upfront any planned transfers from their current year allocations. If adjustments need to be made to transferred amounts later on during the budgeting process, the LEA will need to return to this screen to adjust the planned transfers. Next, if an LEA is applying for carryover and has participating private schools, they will be required to identify if any of the carryover needs to be allocated back to the private schools. If the full amount of carryover attributed to private schools, the function code 371 items from the final expenditure report, is not reallocated to private schools, LEAs will need to enter a justification to explain why the private schools are declining the carryover funds. Recapture of funds originally budgeted to provide equitable services is only permitted when all eligible private schools have declined additional services to utilize the full value of the funding. This decline of additional services can either be in writing or demonstrated by way of a failure to meet reasonable and well-communicated deadlines for communicating to the public schools a desired service plan with the LEA. From the remaining carryover funds, after accounting for any equitable services amounts on the prior screen, LEAs will then be required to identify upfront for any planned transfer funds. In the next section, LEAs will make decisions about how Title I funds will be distributed to different schools. LEAs with participating private schools in Title I Part A will use this screen to identify any amounts from the amount calculated to provide equitable services for those private schools that will be used for indirect or direct administrative costs associated with the provision of those equitable services. New this year, a separate budget item type will be created in each funding source to budget all equitable services costs associated with that funding source under function code 371. Like last year, LEAs will need to enter information about various optional and required reservations from Title I. If a parent engagement reservation is required, the minimum amount will be calculated and entered automatically, with the assumption that the full amount will be utilized at the building level. LEAs will only need to enter data in this section if they want to increase the reservation amount or if they want to utilize a piece of the reservation at the district level, with a maximum of 10%. A change this year is that all LEAs will be required to reserve some amount for students experiencing homelessness. The homeless liaison amount will now be included as part of this reservation rather than the administrative reservation. New this year for LEAs with Title I Part A neglected facilities will be the ability to reserve additional Title I funds to add to the funds already identified to support Title I neglected facilities. Also new this year is a separation of indirect from direct admin costs. Any indirect costs identified here will be attributed back to the fund source if transfers are involved. The max indirect shown assumes no capital outlay or flow-through type of budget items will be created. If an LEA takes a full indirect, but then budgets such costs in their budget, they may need to return to this screen to reduce the indirect amounts since those types of expenses are not eligible for indirect. The bottom section of the reservation screen covers carryover distributions and reservations. Like last year, LEAs will need to enter information about various optional and required reservations from Title I Part A carryover. The base assumption will be that all carryover will go back to being distributed to schools on a per pupil basis. If carryover is going to be used for other reservations or is required to be returned to parent engagement activities, that information will need to be entered here. New this year, if an LEA wants to direct more resources to parent engagement at the district level than the maximum 10% of the reservation on new funds, they can only do so from carryover by indicating the additional reserved amounts on the applicable row in the table. Federal law requires that from the amount reserved for parent and family engagement from new allocations, no more than 10% can be used for district-level activities. If an LEA has Title I Part A neglected facilities with carryover, the amount of that carryover should also be entered on this screen. At the bottom of the reservation screen is a summary that will help an LEA know how much to budget for each of the various budget item types that will be available. All district-level costs, district admin, homeless reservations, and district parental engagement must be budgeted in the Title I budget and not in transfer budgets. New this year, a separate budget item type will be created just for direct administrative costs for the public programs. Also new this year, all school-level parental engagement costs must be budgeted in the Title I budget, not in transfer budgets. This is to help ensure that required minimum amounts are being spent in this area and to aid in federal reporting requirements related to spending on parent and family engagement. The next screen is the allocation to school attendance areas. New this year, the screen will show the grouping for the schools to aid in distribution decisions. Also new this year are added error checks to ensure that LEAs do not allocate 31A funds unless required. Allocating them when not needed creates added work for the LEA to create additional budgets. Section 31A funds should only be allocated when needed to meet minimum funding levels for a school and is not intended to fully identify how your 31A funds will be used within the district. Finally, new this year is an added assurance to clarify that the 31A allocated funds must be supplemental to funds the school otherwise would have received if it had not been a Title I eligible school. A new screen this year is a school level budget screen. If an LEA is transferring funds into Title I, this screen will be used to show where the funds will come from to support each school's Title I budget. Based on this screen, schools will be added to the list of entities and each fund source to create budget items which support the Title I program paid for out of that source. The next section, LEAs will provide information about planned administrative costs, including indirect, for all programs in the Consolidated Application. On this first screen, LEAs will identify any planned administrative costs, including indirect, to be taken off the top of the new allocation for each fund source. Title I will automatically be populated based on the Title I reservation screen. Separate budget item types will be available in each program to budget the details of any direct administrative costs for that program. If the final budget does not align with the planned expenditures identified here and on the next screen, LEAs will need to return to these screens to adjust their planned administrative costs. On the second screen in this group, LEAs will identify any planned administrative costs, including indirect, to be taken off the top of the carryover in each fund source. Again, Title I will automatically be populated based on the Title I reservation screen. The next section looks at Title I Part A neglected facilities and Title I Part D neglected facilities for LEAs that have them. As a new screen this year, LEAs with Title I neglected facilities will be able to use this screen to allocate carryover back to the facilities, identify how the overall facility budget will be funded, and or take direct and indirect administrative costs on the calculated allocation amount for each facility. Based on the results from the screen, entities will be added to individual budget areas as needed, and budget item types will be created to budget the costs as outlined. Another new screen this year, LEAs with Title I delinquent facilities will be able to use this screen to allocate carryover back to the facilities, identify how the overall facility budget will be funded, and or take direct and indirect administrative costs on the calculated allocation amount for each facility. Like the prior screen, based on the results from this screen, entities will be added to individual budget areas as needed, and budget item types will be created to budget the costs as outlined. In this section, LEAs will be able to see reports that represent the results of any equitable services calculations based on the information entered on prior application screens. For LEAs with private schools participating in Title I Part A, this screen will show the results of any equitable service calculations for those programs. For LEAs with private schools participating in Title I Part C or Title III, this screen will show the results of any equitable services calculations for those programs. Note that Title III Part A consortium members will still need to use an external worksheet, and their private school information will not show up on this screen. For LEAs with private schools participating in Title II or Title IV, this screen will show the results of any equitable service calculations for those programs. As a reminder, all equitable services budgets will be created as separate budgets within each program. The next section is only applicable for Consortium Leads in a Title III English Learners Consortium. For Title III Consortium Leads, this screen will be used to allocate carryover back to the agencies and identify what portion of the agency's allocation will be used for administrative costs, equitable services, or consortium level activities. Based on the results of this screen, entities will be added to the Title III budget area to assign budget items in order to budget any remaining allocation for activities at those entities. The next several screens in this section gather information needed for specific programs impacted by or that are part of the programs in the Consolidated Application. Although not shown in this presentation, this will include the Equitable Access screen, previously part of the Consolidated Application, as well as the Language Assistance Plan for English learners. New this year, LEAs will be required to check the assurances that are applicable to their Title IV budgets. These assurances will be used to trigger the required error checks on amounts budgeted for various activities in Title IV or transfers to Title IV. Districts using less than $30,000 for Title IV programs will only need to check one of the three assurances in the second group. All districts must check the first assurance in the first group. New this year, only for SRSA eligible LEAs will be an option to exercise greater flexibility in the way they utilize Title II and Title IV funds without having to transfer those funds. This flexibility allows the LEA to waive the spending rules for Title IV. The screen will only show for LEAs that are SRSA eligible. The next section in the Con app will be the different budget screens with targeted amounts to be budgeted based on information entered earlier in the application. Error checks will be in place to ensure the budget matches the target. If changes are needed, the LEA will need to go back and make adjustments on the earlier screens. New this year will be several different budget item types for each title program. The exact types of items that will be available depend on the particular program and the decisions the LEA made earlier in the application. For example, if the LEA reserved funds in a program for direct administrative costs, there will be an administrative budget type available. If not, no administrative budget type will be visible. The specialized budget item types are administrative budget items, equitable services budget items, district level program budget items, entity level program budget items, and transfer budget items, which may be either entity level or program level. As before, each budget item will require several details depending on exactly what is being budgeted. These include function code, description, cost by object code, FTE, and hours, as well as a strategy. The combination of the strategy with the description will be used to show that the particular item is reasonable, necessary, and allocable to the funding source. Descriptions still need to be concise, 300 characters or less, which should make it clear why the item is being included and what will be the direct outcome of the expenditure. For professional development items, this means that they also show how they are not just standalone, one-day, or short-term workshops, but instead are sustained and systemic effort to improve the school or district's systems. Adding budget items will include several additional fields depending on the specifics of the budget area where the item is being created. The first drop-down will require the LEA to identify the type of budget item being created. The exact list will vary based on the budget area, but generally will include admin costs, equitable services, district program costs, entity-level program costs, and transfers or SRSA Alternative Fund Use Authority for districts eligible to use such flexibility. If the LEA selects either a transfer budget item type or a flexible use budget item type, they will then need to use the sub-budget item type to identify which type of transfer or flexible use is being applied. This year, LEAs will be able to use a drop-down to select a strategy from MyKIP that the budget item type is connected to. If the LEA does not have a strategy in MyKIP to link the item to, there will be an Other option. If the LEA selects the Other option, they will have the ability to name an additional strategy in the Other strategy description box. This field is limited to 100 characters. If the LEA budget type is a Title IV program cost or a transfer to Title IV, the LEA will need to use the check boxes to select one or more focus areas that align with the planned expense. New this year is a single item of expense may be counted in more than one focus area. If the budget item type is a Title V budget item or a transfer to Title V, the LEA will need to select from the list of authorized activities to select the type of activity that aligns with the planned expense. The bottom section of the Add Budget Items screen will capture additional details about the budget items. If the strategy the LEA selected was from MyKIP, the LEA will be able to select an activity associated with that strategy from MyKIP to act as starting text for the item description. If the budget item type is an entity-level program budget item, such as a Title I school budget request or a Title I-D delinquent facility program request or a consortium member level budget request, or if the item is an equitable services budget request, the entity budget drop-down will be required for the LEA to identify which entity level budget the request belongs to or which private school the budget request will support. The list will be pre-populated with eligible entities based on the budget type being created. The main item description field will be used to give the specifics related to the budget item. If the district selected an activity in the field above, that information will pre-populate this field and will be available to edit as needed to provide the necessary level of detail for approval. This field is limited to 300 characters, including spaces. Finally, the LEA will need to select the appropriate function code to use. The list of available function codes will be dependent on the prior selections on the budget item screen. For example, if it's private school cost, the only function code that will be available is function code 371. The LEA will then complete the financial information, including FTE or hours, as needed based on the request. If an LEA needs to provide additional supporting information, such as job descriptions, contracts, MOUs, or other such things, each budget area will have a separate upload section to upload materials associated with that budget area. In general, however, the description and other details provided for each budget item on the Add Budget screen should be sufficient to support most budget requests without the need for additional uploads. The budget summary screens will be similar to what is in MEGS Plus. For the Con app, the indirect amounts will be pre-populated based on the data entered on earlier screens and not editable on the summary screen. If LEAs budget amounts that are not eligible for indirect and they had taken the max indirect amount shown earlier, an error will trigger to force the LEA to return to earlier screens to adjust the indirect plan. Budget detail screens will have added functionality to sort, search, or export to Excel. Although not shown here, this will also include the ability to filter based on the budget item type, entity or school the item is for, focus area, or authorized activity type. Unlike last year, There will not be separate screens for each individual school level budget. However, totals budgeted to each school will be shown on the budget summary screen with error checks to ensure that the correct amount of funds is being budgeted in each applicable area. LEAs can still generate detailed budget lists for each school or area by using the sort and filter functionality of this screen. Flag budget detail screens will have added functionality to filter by flag status. Consultants will be able to provide feedback to districts on individual budget items by marking them as approved, modifications required, or unallowable, and providing a comment to explain what modifications are needed or why the item was marked unallowable. This information will also show up on the individual Add Budget Item screens when the budget description is clicked within any of the other budget screens. To support communication between the LEA and the reviewer, in the application, LEAs will be able to leave notes to reviewers using the Notes feature. The New Note button will be available on most pages. When the Notes button is pressed, a new window will open where the LEA can leave a note. If the LEA needs to attach a file to the note, they can click the paperclip icon. To send or save the note, the LEA should then click the Send icon. Notes can also be accessed under the Tools menu. This screen will show all of the notes in the application. The LEA can then add a new note on the top line or reply to an old note under the old note. In conclusion, the new ConApp is still in development in Nexus. We are also working on a detailed help document to provide additional information and guidance, which will be available on our website at www.michigan.gov/OFS when it is complete. While there are many changes, some of the key changes are listed on this slide, including one seamless application to merge the TIS, the Equitable Services Worksheet, and the Consolidated Application. Added error checks to reduce application errors, simplified navigation throughout the application, a connection to MyKIP to reduce duplicative data entry, and added support for line items in the budget via inclusion of a strategy with the description. At this time, I'd like to provide an opportunity to address any remaining questions that anyone may have. You may also contact the regional consultant assigned to your district if you have further questions. We will also have a complete help document available on the Office of Educational Services website within the Consolidated Application Important Information link under Tools and Resources.